The lake had always been there, long before the subdivision signs went up and long before anyone decided to laminate bylaws and call themselves an authority. It sat just beyond the last row of identical beige houses, tucked behind a thin line of cottonwoods that most residents treated like a decorative fence rather than the living border it actually was. To me, the lake wasn't scenery. It was routine, history, and quiet all wrapped into one. I fished there the way some people drink morning coffee, not because it was exciting, but because it was grounding. I had been fishing that lake for years before the Homeowners Association decided to notice it. When I first moved in, the lake wasn't listed on any HOA map. It wasn't maintained, landscaped, or branded. It simply existed, fed by underground springs and runoff from the hills beyond the development. The old county records called it a retention basin with a natural aquifer connection. Most people just called it the pond, dismissively, as if the name stripped it of importance. That dismissal was convenient, especially for the HOA board. It meant they didn't have to spend money on it. No benches, no signs, no fences, no official rules. And for a while, that worked in my favor. I could fish in peace, cast from the bank at dawn, and leave before most people had even opened their blinds. Over time, though, the neighborhood filled in. New families arrived. Joggers discovered the path around the lake. Dog walkers claimed the shoreline. With them came the HOA's growing obsession with appearances. Grass height became a weekly fixation. Approved mailbox colors were suddenly a serious matter, and eventually eyes turned toward the lake. It started subtly. Complaints about unsightly behavior appeared in the monthly newsletter, vague references to unauthorized activities near community property. The lake still wasn't officially HOA property, but that didn't stop the board from acting like it was. I noticed more people watching when I fished, lingering looks from behind sunglasses, phones occasionally raised in ways that suggested documentation rather than photography. The tension didn't come from everyone. Most neighbors didn't care. Some waved, a few asked about the fish, others thanked me for keeping the area clean since I always picked up trash along the shore. The problem wasn't the community. It was one person who had appointed herself the voice of order. She lived in the largest house closest to the lake, a corner property with a view she clearly believed belonged exclusively to her. Her lawn was flawless in the aggressive way that suggested constant surveillance and chemical warfare against nature. She had been on the HOA board longer than anyone else, and she treated that tenure like inherited power. Everything about her presence radiated ownership, despite the fact that nothing about the lake legally belonged to her. Her fixation on me grew steadily. First, it was looks. Then it was notes in the newsletter about fishing being potentially hazardous. Then came the suggestion that fishing disrupted wildlife. The irony of that claim was almost impressive, given the fertilizers and pesticides regularly applied to her lawn. Still, the narrative was forming, and it didn't include me as a harmless hobbyist. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. I had checked the county maps, I had read the environmental easements, the lake wasn't HOA controlled, and fishing was permitted under local regulations. I carried my license, I followed the rules, I stayed calm, believing facts would eventually matter. That belief began to crack the morning I noticed the water. The lake had always been clear enough to see the shadows of fish moving below the surface. That morning, the water looked wrong. There was a dull sheen clinging to the top, not quite oily, but unnatural. The smell wasn't strong, but it wasn't normal either. It carried a faint chemical sharpness that didn't belong in a natural body of water. At first, I assumed runoff, a spill from nearby landscaping, maybe excessive fertilizer from the previous night's lawn treatments. But as I walked the shoreline, the signs became harder to dismiss. Dead insects floated near the edges. A frog lay motionless among the reeds. The usual quiet movement beneath the surface was gone. I didn't cast my line. I didn't even sit down. Something had been introduced to the lake deliberately, and whatever it was, it hadn't been accidental. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. The water darkened. Fish began surfacing, sluggish and disoriented. By the third day, several floated belly up near the banks. Word spread quickly, not through official channels, but through the kind of hushed concern that travels faster than any HOA email blast. That was when the notices appeared. Printed flyers were posted at the trail entrances, warning residents to stay away from the lake due to unsanitary conditions. The language was carefully chosen, vague enough to avoid blame, authoritative enough to discourage questions. There was no mention of an investigation, no mention of testing, just an instruction to avoid the area until further notice. The HOA board, led by its longest-serving member, had finally taken action, not to fix the problem, but to control the narrative. As I stood there reading one of the flyers, the realization settled in slowly and heavily. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't incompetence. Someone had decided that stopping me from fishing was more important than the health of the lake itself. And as I looked out over the still water, now eerily lifeless, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake's importance extended far beyond recreation. The old records I had skimmed years ago came back to me in fragments, words like aquifer, recharge, overflow connection. The lake wasn't just a pond, it was part of something bigger, and whoever had poisoned it hadn't crossed a line. They had tampered with a system they clearly didn't understand. As the sun climbed higher and the neighborhood stirred awake, I realized this story wasn't going to stay contained within HOA newsletters and passive-aggressive flyers. The lake had secrets buried beneath its surface, and the damage already done was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the lake was no longer something the neighborhood could ignore. The smell had intensified, not overpowering, but persistent enough to seep into evening walks and open windows. The once casual joggers stopped circling the path. Dog owners tugged leashes tighter, steering clear of the shoreline. The HOA flyers multiplied, their wording growing more ominous while still avoiding any mention of responsibility. What stood out most was what wasn't happening. There were no test kits, no county trucks, no environmental crews in reflective vests. Just silence, layered under printed warnings and locked comment sections on the HOA's online portal. It was as if the board believed that by declaring the lake off-limits, the problem itself would simply pause out of courtesy. I didn't share that optimism. Years earlier, out of pure curiosity, I had requested public records related to the land before the development was built. At the time, it was nothing more than an interesting rabbit hole. Old surveys, environmental assessments, water flow diagrams. I remembered one detail vividly now. The lake wasn't isolated. It sat atop a shallow aquifer system that fed into a larger underground network. That network, in turn, supplied several auxiliary wells used during peak demand periods. Those wells weren't advertised. They didn't have signs or plaques. They existed quietly, activated only when the main municipal supply dipped too low during summer heat waves or drought conditions. Most residents didn't know they existed, and the HOA certainly never mentioned them. But the infrastructure was there, hidden beneath manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges. Poisoning a lake like this wasn't like dumping something into a swimming pool. Water moved, slowly, sometimes invisibly, but relentlessly. Whatever had been poured into the lake didn't just stay put. It seeped, filtered, migrated. I made calls. The first was to the County Environmental Health Office. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't speculate. I simply reported signs of contamination in a retention lake connected to an aquifer system and asked whether testing had been initiated. The pause on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. No report had been filed, no testing scheduled, no alerts issued. The second call was to the water utility. That conversation was shorter, clippered, and far more serious. I referenced the auxiliary wells by their permit numbers.
There was another pause, longer this time, followed by a request for my name, address, and the exact location of the lake. By the next morning, the first unmarked truck arrived. It didn't have logos or flashing lights, just a plain white vehicle with municipal plates and two people who didn't linger. They walked the perimeter, took samples, made notes, and left without acknowledging the handful of residents watching from a distance. Within hours, a second truck followed, then a third, this one clearly labeled and impossible to ignore. That was when the HOA noticed something was happening they didn't control. An emergency email went out that afternoon, urging residents to remain calm and assuring everyone that the situation was being handled internally. The phrasing was bold, considering the growing presence of county personnel. The email also included a reminder that unauthorized communication with external agencies could complicate matters. It was the first time the board openly acknowledged that outside agencies were involved, even if they tried to frame it as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. The woman who had taken issue with my fishing was suddenly very visible. She stood near the lake's edge, arms crossed, watching the activity with a tight expression that suggested frustration rather than concern. She spoke animatedly to another board member, gesturing toward the water, then toward the houses nearby, as if drawing invisible boundaries that reality refused to respect. By the end of the day, the lake was officially cordoned off. Real barriers this time, not flyers. Yellow tape, temporary fencing, warning signs with legal language that carried weight. The tone had shifted dramatically, and everyone could feel it. Rumors filled the vacuum left by the HOA's silence. Some said a chemical spill from a lawn service had gone wrong. Others whispered about illegal dumping. A few speculated about algae blooms or natural die-offs. None of those explanations accounted for the speed at which officials had escalated their response. Environmental agencies didn't mobilize like this for minor issues. I received a call that evening from the county. They didn't accuse, they asked questions. How long had I noticed changes? What exactly did I see? Did I have photographs? Had I ever known the lake to be treated with chemicals before? I answered calmly, methodically, sticking to observations and documented history. At no point did they mention the HOA, but they didn't need to. The following morning, water testing results began circulating internally among agencies. I didn't see the full reports yet, but the reaction was immediate. Additional sampling sites were added downstream, both literal and subterranean. The auxiliary wells were taken offline as a precaution. That single decision rippled outwards in ways the HOA never anticipated. Within 24 hours, residents began receiving notices from the water utility about temporary conservation measures. Lawn watering schedules were restricted. Car washing was discouraged. Language about supply adjustments appeared, carefully worded to avoid panic. People started connecting dots. The lake was no longer just an eyesore or a nuisance. It was suddenly relevant to daily life in a way that made inconvenience personal. When water pressure dipped slightly during peak hours, frustration followed. When sprinklers shut off mid-cycle, anger bubbled. The HOA tried to regain control. A special meeting was announced, closed to non-residents, and framed as an informational session. The agenda was vague, the timing was inconvenient. It felt less like transparency and more like damage containment. Still, attendance was higher than usual. Fear has a way of motivating participation. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. By that point, the situation had moved beyond neighborhood politics. This was no longer about fishing or perceived property values. This was about public resources and regulatory oversight. Behind the scenes, investigators traced the contamination back to its source. They followed the chemical signature, matched it to commercially available compounds, and cross-referenced purchase records. The substance wasn't agricultural runoff or an accidental spill. It was a targeted application of an algicide not approved for use in natural water bodies, especially ones connected to groundwater systems. Someone chose it deliberately. Someone believed the lake was isolated, insignificant, disposable. As the week drew to a close, the woman who once watched me fish with barely concealed disdain avoided the shoreline entirely. Her house remained immaculate, her lawn still aggressively green, but the confidence that once radiated from her posture had begun to crack, because the truth was working its way upward, just like the water itself. And once it surfaced fully, there would be no way to fence it off with yellow tape or bury it under carefully worded emails.
The shift from rumor to reality happened quietly, without sirens or public announcements. It arrived in envelopes, email threads, and formal requests for information that carried the unmistakable weight of authority. While residents speculated on social media and the HOA continued issuing carefully diluted updates, the real story was being assembled elsewhere, piece by piece, document by document. Investigators didn't start with accusations. They started with math. Chemical volumes were calculated against the size of the lake. Dilution rates were compared to measured toxicity levels. Timelines were overlaid with weather data, wind direction, and recent maintenance schedules. What emerged was a profile that ruled out accident after accident until intention was the only explanation left standing. The substance introduced into the lake wasn't something that drifted in by chance. It had been poured in sufficient quantity at a specific access point during a narrow window of time. The location mattered, the timing mattered, and most importantly, the method required access without scrutiny. That narrowed the field quickly. The lake didn't have many convenient entry points. Most of its shoreline was uneven, overgrown, or visible from multiple houses. Only one section offered easy access, clear footing, and privacy. It bordered a stretch of manicured lawn that sloped gently down to the water, unobstructed by trees or brush. That lawn belonged to the same house that had always treated the lake as a personal backdrop rather than a shared resource. Records backed it up. Purchase logs from a local agricultural supply store showed a sale of the exact algicide identified in the water samples. The buyer had used a personal account, not a business one, and had purchased more than what would reasonably be needed for a decorative pond or small water feature. The date of purchase lined up perfectly with the earliest signs of contamination. Surveillance footage from the store's parking lot confirmed the vehicle, make, model, license plate, all registered to one address, an address the HOA knew well. As these details solidified, the tone of official communication changed. The county no longer spoke in hypotheticals. The water utilities' notices became firmer, more directive. The auxiliary wells remained offline, and contingency plans were enacted to stabilize supply. The inconvenience was no longer temporary. It was measurable, ongoing, and increasingly expensive. Residents felt it in small but persistent ways. Showers that sputtered during peak hours, notices about delayed irrigation system activations, increased water bills due to infrastructure adjustments. Each frustration added pressure, and that pressure needed somewhere to go. The HOA tried to absorb it. They issued statements emphasizing cooperation with authorities and reiterated their commitment to community safety. They avoided specifics, citing ongoing investigations. They discouraged speculation while quietly disabling comment sections and moderating neighborhood forums more aggressively than ever. It didn't work. People began filing public records requests of their own. Emails between board members surfaced, revealing internal discussions that were far less composed than their public messaging suggested. There were complaints about me, about fishing, about outsiders using their lake. There were messages expressing frustration that prior warnings had been ignored. There was even a suggestion, buried deep in a thread, that the lake needed to be made unusable to discourage activity. That phrase didn't age well.
As those emails circulated privately at first, then more openly, the narrative snapped into focus. This wasn't a case of misguided maintenance. It was retaliation disguised as stewardship, an attempt to solve a personal annoyance with a chemical shortcut, under the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. The HOA board fractured almost immediately. Emergency resignations followed, announced with vague language about personal reasons and family obligations. One member stepped down citing health concerns. Another cited work commitments. The timing fooled no one. Meetings were postponed. Quorums became difficult to assemble. The HOA's once rigid structure buckled under the weight of its own documentation. The woman at the center of it all retreated from public view. Her house remained occupied, her lawn still pristine, but the visible confidence was gone. Curtains stayed drawn during the day. The driveway sat empty more often than not. When she did appear, it was briefly, purposefully, and without the performative authority she once wielded so freely. Official notices arrived shortly after. The county issued a formal finding of environmental contamination linked to deliberate chemical introduction. The language was careful but firm. Fines were outlined. Remediation requirements were detailed. Long-term monitoring plans were established. The lake would not simply recover on its own. It would need active intervention, and that intervention would not be cheap. Then came the letter that shifted everything from administrative to personal. A notice of liability was delivered to a single homeowner, naming her as the responsible party pending final adjudication. The document referenced evidence, corroborating records, and potential civil consequences. It also included a clause noting that criminal charges were under review, given the impact on public water infrastructure. That was the moment fear became visible. The HOA could no longer shield her. The board could no longer pretend neutrality. This was no longer a neighborhood disagreement. It was a legal reckoning with consequences that extended far beyond property lines. Community sentiment flipped almost overnight. Where once there had been passive acceptance of strict rules and aesthetic micromanagement, there was now anger. People felt betrayed, not just because of the contamination, but because of the arrogance behind it. The assumption that one person's preferences justified risking the health and resources of everyone else. I became an unwilling reference point. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged me before now stopped to ask questions, not accusatory ones, curious ones. They wanted to understand the lake, the system beneath it, how close the community had come to a much larger disaster. I answered when I could, always carefully, always sticking to facts. Fishing, it turned out, had never been the problem. Control had been. As cleanup crews began their work, draining sections of the lake, filtering sediment, and installing monitoring equipment, the reality of the damage became impossible to ignore. The lake looked wounded, scarred by intervention, but slowly stabilizing. The process would take months, possibly years, and the cost, financial and reputational, was still climbing. The next phase wouldn't be handled by environmental agencies or water utilities. It would move into courtrooms and insurance offices where intent mattered and excuses carried little weight.
The first lawsuit landed quietly, filed on a weekday morning when most residents were focused on work, school drop-offs, and the small routines that had been disrupted but not yet overturned. It didn't come from the county or the state, it came from the water utility. The filing outlined damages in precise, unemotional language. Costs associated with shutting down auxiliary wells, emergency water sourcing, infrastructure strain, long-term monitoring. The total climbed into figures that made even seasoned attorneys pause. This wasn't punitive, it was reimbursement, and it established a baseline that others would soon follow. Within days, the county announced its own civil action, separate from regulatory fines already assessed. The justification was straightforward: contamination of a protected water-connected body, reckless disregard for environmental safeguards, and endangerment of public resources. Criminal charges remained under review, but the civil case alone carried consequences that would reshape lives. The homeowner named in every filing responded the only way she could, through counsel. Her attorney issued a brief statement denying malicious intent and framing the incident as a misunderstanding of product usage. The explanation hinged on ignorance rather than malice, a claim that might have carried weight if not for the emails, purchase records, and volume calculations that painted a far more deliberate picture. Ignorance doesn't usually involve buying excess quantities of restricted chemicals. Ignorance doesn't usually involve choosing a time when neighbors are least likely to notice. Ignorance doesn't usually involve celebrating the sudden absence of undesirable activity. The HOA, sensing the widening blast radius, scrambled to distance itself. A special election was announced to reconstitute the board. Emergency bylaws were proposed to limit liability. Statements were released asserting that the actions of a single homeowner did not reflect the values of the association. Those statements were met with skepticism. Emails leaked showing complaints about fishing had been discussed repeatedly in board meetings. While no one else had authorized poisoning the lake, the atmosphere of hostility and encouragement towards making the problem go away was hard to deny. Silence, in retrospect, looked a lot like endorsement. Insurance companies noticed. The HOA's liability insurer initiated its own investigation, combing through records to determine whether coverage applied. Exclusions for intentional acts loomed large. Premiums were adjusted upward preemptively. Coverage limits were reevaluated. The board's legal expenses alone began draining reserves that had once been earmarked for landscaping upgrades and holiday decorations. Residents felt the impact quickly. A special assessment was announced to cover immediate legal costs. The amount wasn't catastrophic on its own, but it was symbolic. People who had never cared about the lake, the fishing, or the rules now had a line item on their budget directly tied to one person's vendetta. Anger turned organized. Informal groups formed, then formal ones. Residents demanded transparency, meeting minutes, full disclosure of communications. They requested audits. They questioned past enforcement actions. Patterns emerged: selective rule enforcement, targeted citations, a culture that rewarded control over cooperation. The woman at the center of it all became a cautionary absence. Her house, once the unofficial headquarters of neighborhood oversight, was listed for sale. The timing wasn't subtle. The listing photos avoided the lake entirely, focusing instead on interior upgrades and generic backyard shots that carefully cropped out the water. The price was ambitious. The market response was not. As word spread beyond the neighborhood, the stigma attached itself to the address. Prospective buyers asked questions. Agents hesitated. Disclosures became complicated. What had once been a prestige property turned into a liability wrapped in brick and siding. Meanwhile, remediation at the lake continued. Specialists installed aeration systems. Contaminated sediment was removed and replaced. Native plants were reintroduced to stabilize the shoreline. Regular testing became routine, with results posted publicly by the county rather than filtered through HOA channels. Slowly, signs of life returned. Insects reappeared first, then small fish. The process was cautious, deliberate, and expensive. Every step was documented, every cost tracked. The bill, when finalized, would be sent to one person, but the lesson was being absorbed by many. I watched from a distance. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in seeing a place I loved damaged, even temporarily. The lake had suffered because someone saw it as an obstacle rather than a resource. That loss lingered even as accountability took shape. Fishing remained prohibited during remediation. I respected that. The quiet mornings I once spent casting lines were replaced by walks along the fence, reading posted updates, watching the water slowly regain its clarity. The community, for its part, changed.
Rules were rewritten, committees were restructured, the language of governance shifted away from aesthetics toward stewardship. People asked better questions, they challenged assumptions, they remembered, perhaps for the first time, that living near shared resources came with shared responsibility. The woman who had set all of this in motion eventually left. The sale closed below asking. The departure was unannounced, no farewell email, no statement, just an empty house and a for sale sign quietly removed. Legal proceedings continued without her presence in the neighborhood, but her absence didn't end the story. Judgments were still pending, fines still accruing. Consequences don't disappear when you move. As summer turned to fall, the lake reached a milestone. Testing showed contaminant levels had dropped below critical thresholds. The auxiliary wells were cautiously brought back online, water pressure stabilized, restrictions eased. Life edged toward normal. But normal had been redefined.
By the time winter settled in, the lake no longer looked like a crime scene. The temporary fencing came down section by section, replaced with unobtrusive signage that explained the restoration process rather than warning people away. The water had regained its clarity, not the pristine glassiness it once had, but something deeper and more resilient. It moved again, responding to wind and wildlife, no longer stagnant or sick. The first official notice declaring the lake safe for limited recreational use arrived quietly. No ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a county-issued update posted online and mirrored on a physical board near the trail. Fishing was permitted again under existing regulations with additional monitoring in place. When I returned to the shoreline with my gear, it felt different, not worse, just heavier. The quiet I had once taken for granted now carried memory. The reeds where dead fish had floated were alive again, but I remembered what they had held. The water reflected the sky like it always had, but I knew what moved beneath it now in a way I hadn't before. The lake wasn't just a place to fish anymore. It was a reminder of how fragile systems became when people treated them like personal property. Others returned too. Families walked the path again. Joggers resumed their loops. Children stopped to watch the surface ripple. The lake reclaimed its role as a shared space, but the way people interacted with it had changed. There was less entitlement, more curiosity. People read the posted information, they asked questions, they understood, maybe for the first time, that the water didn't end at the shoreline. The legal process moved slower. Judgments were issued in phases. Civil liability was established clearly and publicly. The numbers attached to it were staggering, not because they were inflated, but because damage at that scale always is. Environmental remediation, infrastructure strain, monitoring, legal costs. The final sum ensured that the lesson would follow its subject for the rest of her life, regardless of where she lived. Criminal charges were ultimately filed, reduced from what some had expected, but still significant. Reckless endangerment, environmental harm. The plea agreement avoided prison time but ensured probation, mandatory education, and a permanent record that would surface whenever trust was required. The story didn't end with punishment, it ended with change. The HOA, once obsessed with appearances and authority, became cautious to the point of humility. New board members were elected, many of them openly critical of how things had been run before. Policies were rewritten with input from residents rather than imposed upon them. Transparency stopped being a buzzword and became a necessity. Meetings became longer, messier, and more honest. The lake was officially recognized in HOA documents for the first time, not as an asset to control, but as a resource to protect. Partnerships were formed with local environmental groups. Educational signage was expanded.
Maintenance contracts were revised to exclude harmful chemicals anywhere near water flow zones. What had once been ignored was now understood. The community's relationship with authority shifted as well. People questioned more. They asked for documentation. They challenged assumptions. The idea that someone could enforce rules simply because they had always done so lost its grip. Fear had been replaced with memory. As for the woman who started it all, she faded into the background of other neighborhoods, other associations, other places where people didn't yet know her history. But records have a way of resurfacing, just like water. The story followed her in fragments, in disclosures and background checks and awkward explanations that never quite satisfied. She had wanted silence. She had created permanence. On a cold morning near the end of the year, I stood at the lake again, watching mist rise from the surface. The fish were back, smaller than before, but plentiful. The line cast cleanly, the rhythm returned. What struck me most wasn't the restoration of the lake, but the restoration of balance, not just ecological, but social. The community had learned, painfully, that shared spaces required shared respect, and that power without understanding was more dangerous than negligence. The lake endured because it was part of something larger than any one person's view. That truth had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, feeding homes, sustaining life, connecting people who never realized how close they came to losing it. The water remembered, and now so did everyone else.